Hello, welcome back to part 3 of week 4 from the ECE 9013 course. In this part, we are going to describe how functions can be used as arguments to other functions and how can that impact the variable scope. So arguments, or basically the input to a function, can take any type, even function itself. So for example, here we define function A, in which we are printing inside function A. Then we define function B to take a variable y inside function B. We're printing that out and we're returning y. And then we define a function C that takes an input z. We print a statement inside function C, and then we're returning z off. So this means that the return here of this function is a function in itself. So here, when we call A does not take any parameters. When we call B, it takes one parameter. When we call C, it takes a parameter, which is a function, basically. So let's show this in terms of the scope. So in the global scope, function A is a set of code, function B is another set of code, and function C is another set of code. Now, within the scope of A, because there is no return statement, that's why this function returns a none when we print out. Now, in this case, we are trying to print out the value of 5 plus the output from function B. So now within the scope of function B, the variable y has a value of 2 because this is the value being given into the function. So this value of 2 is returned. So when we print out, it will print out 5 plus 2, which is 7. Now we go to the third print. So function C is calling function A. So, and function A does not have any return. So within the scope of function C, the variable Z has a value of function A. But function A, the return from it is none. So the none is returned from the scope of function A into Z, and then Z is returned back to the global scope. So this is an example of how this is in real life. So inside a function, you can access a variable defined outside it. However, inside a function, you cannot modify a variable defined outside. So what we mean here is that you can get a value from the global scope, but you cannot modify it. You can use what we call global variables, but this is frowned upon. So for example here, if we define f of y, and then we say that x equal to 1, x is redefined within the scope of f. And then we print out, we increment x by 1 and we print it out. And here within the global scope, we specify x equal to 5, and then f of x, and we print x. These correspond to different x objects. In this case, for example, x is from outside of the function g. So x inside g is picked up from the scope that called the function g. In this case, for example, this would give us an error because we are trying to reassign the value for x, which is in the global scope, not within the scope of h. So here the difference between the first case and the last case is the fact that in the first case, we defined a new variable x within the scope of f, and we modified it. In this case, we are trying to modify the global or the variable x that was defined in the global scope. So in all of these three statements, we print x from the global or the main program scope, not from the function scope. This is a URL that you can use in order to visualize how the variable is changing based on some line of code. So here is another example in which we have the global scope. So g is a function with some code, x is defined to be the variable 3, and then z is g of x. So imagine if g of x had another function within it. So within the scope of g, x is set to 3 because it takes the variable x as an input, and then we have another bunch of code which is h. Now we did a modification for the variable of x, so now x within the scope of g becomes 4, and then we still have some code for h, and then we return x. So note that within the scope of h, that the variable x has a value abc, but because it doesn't have a return function, it will return a none to the scope of g. And then when we return x here to the variable z, it will return the value 4, which was the value of x within the scope of g. So now in the global scope, we have g, which is a bunch of code. X in the global scope has a value of 3, and z has a value of 4. So as a conclusion, decomposition and abstraction, which are the basis for the concepts of functions, are powerful concepts together. They allow us to make the code to be used many times, but only has to be debugged once. Thank you.